The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the lax terminal. Nathan Miller, wearing faded combat fatigues and carrying a backpack, walked down the long hallway leading to the arrivals area. His boots, coated in desert dust, felt out of place on the gleaming marble floor. 10 months in Syria, 10 months where every day was a struggle for survival, where the air smelled of smoke and sweat and silence was a rare guest. Now he was going home, but instead of relief, there was something heavy, intangible, like a premonition, churning in his chest. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, feeling the material dig into his sore shoulder. Nathan's face, weathered, with its sharp features and a week's worth of stubble, was impassive, but his eyes betrayed weariness. Not the physical kind, he had grown accustomed to that over the years, but the kind that nested somewhere deeper in his soul. He thought of Linda, of her smile, which had always been an anchor for him, of Cody, who had probably grown taller over the months. Nathan tried to picture their faces, but the images blurred like photographs faded in the sun. The crowd in the arrivals hall was buzzing. People were milling about, hugging new arrivals, laughing, crying. Nathan stopped at the glass doors leading into the waiting room and took a deep breath. His heart was beating a little faster than usual. He noticed them right away. Linda, standing a little to the side, holding Cody's hand. Her blonde hair was neatly done, her dress simple but elegant, the way she liked it. Cody, in jeans and a baseball t-shirt, held a homemade sign. "Welcome home, Dad." The letters were uneven, drawn with markers, and an American flag was stuck crookedly on the edge of the sign. Nathan smiled, but it was a forced smile. He stepped forward, and Cody, noticing him, pulled away from Linda's arms and ran toward him. "Daddy!" the boy shouted, his voice rising above the roar of the crowd. He lunged at Nathan, grabbing him around the waist with such force that he nearly staggered. "Hey, champ," Nathan dropped to one knee, hugging his son. "Have you gotten taller than me in the last few months?" Cody laughed, burying his face in his father's shoulder. His hair smelled like baby shampoo, and the smell so familiar, so homey for a moment pushed everything else out of Nathan's head. The sand, the gunshots, the faces of those he'd lost. "I missed you, Dad," Cody muttered, not letting go. "Me too, baby." Nathan patted his son on the head, then looked up at Linda. She stood a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest. Her smile was warm, but there was something off about it, like she was putting on a mask to hide her tiredness or something. Nathan stood up, still holding Cody's hand, and walked over to her. "Linda," he said quietly, holding out his hand. "Nathan." She stepped toward him, hugging him, but the embrace was brief, almost formal. Her hands slid down his back and quickly pulled away. "Welcome back." He looked at her, trying to catch the familiar glint in her eyes, but instead he saw a shadow. Something had changed. Maybe he had been away too long. Maybe it was just fatigue, but his chest tightened. "Are you okay?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "Sure," Linda nodded, adjusting a strand of hair. "It's just a lot of things. Let's go, the car's waiting." She turned and walked toward the door without looking back. Cody tugged at Nathan's hand, chatting about school, baseball, how he'd won some math competition. Nathan listened, nodding, but his thoughts were on Linda. She'd always been his rock, his beacon. But now she seemed distant, like she was standing behind glass. The drive home dragged on slowly. Los Angeles passed by the car windows. Palm trees, billboards, traffic jams. Cody sat in the back, excitedly talking about the new video game he had gotten for his birthday. Linda drove, her fingers tightly gripping the steering wheel. Nathan stared at her profile, trying to figure out what was wrong. She was silent, answering Cody's questions briefly, almost mechanically. "Lynn," Nathan turned to her, lowering his voice so his son wouldn't hear. "What's going on? You're somehow different." She glanced at him quickly, then looked back at the road. "It's okay, Nathan. I'm just tired. Cody, fasten your seatbelt better, okay?" Cody rolled his eyes, but obeyed. Nathan frowned. Linda had always been straightforward. If something was bothering her, she would talk about it. But now she was closing herself off, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. "Can we talk?" he asked, trying not to push. "Later," she snapped. "Let's just get home." He nodded, leaning back in his seat. Familiar streets flashed past the window, but they seemed alien, as if he had returned to the wrong city, to the wrong life. The house greeted him with the smell of freshly cut grass and silence. The two-story suburban cottage, with its white picket fence and swing set in the yard, looked just like he remembered. But something was wrong. Nathan noticed it as soon as he walked through the door. In the living room, where their old couch had been, there was now a new sofa leather, expensive, not at all Linda's style. On the wall hung a new painting, abstract, with sharp strokes of red and blue. Linda had always preferred landscapes. "New sofa?" Nathan asked, setting his backpack down by the door. "Yes." Linda took off her shoes and walked into the kitchen. "The old one is completely worn out." "And the painting?" He nodded at the wall. "A gift," she answered shortly, pouring water into a glass. "Cody, go get changed. Dinner is coming soon." Cody rushed upstairs, leaving them alone. Nathan walked over to Linda, who was standing at the sink with her back to him. "Lynn," he began, trying to speak gently, "I know 10 months is a long time. I know it's been hard for you. But if something's wrong, tell me. Please." She froze, her shoulders tensing. Then she turned, and something flickered in her eyes, fear, guilt, he couldn't tell. "It's okay, Nathan." Her voice was too even, too controlled. "You just got back. Let's not start there." "Why that?" He stepped closer, feeling the heat growing in his chest. "Linda, I'm not blind. You barely looked at me at the airport. You barely touched me. What's going on?" She looked away, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "Nothing's happening," she said, but her voice was shaking. "I'm just tired. Work, Cody, all of it. You need to rest, Nathan. You just got back from the war." "This isn't a war," he snapped, though he knew she was right. The operation was secret, and he couldn't tell her anything more than generalities. But that didn't explain her coldness. "Linda, look at me." She looked up, and for a moment he thought she was about to say something. But then her face became impassive again. "Dinner is in an hour," she said, and left the kitchen. Nathan stood there, feeling the silence weighing on him. He walked into the living room and sat down on the new sofa that smelled of leather and someone else's hands. Questions swirled in his head, but there were no answers. He had known Linda for 12 years. He knew her every gesture, every look. And now she was not the Linda he had left 10 months ago. Dinner passed in tense silence. Cody chattered away, talking about school and his friends, but Nathan and Linda barely made conversation. Nathan looked at his wife, trying to catch a hint of what was going on, but she avoided his gaze. After dinner, Cody went to watch TV, and Nathan helped Linda clear the table. "I'll unpack," he said when they were finished. "Maybe you want to help?" "I need to check my email," she replied without looking at him. "Work." "Linda," he caught her arm, stopping her. "Talk to me, please." She looked at him, and pain flashed in her eyes, but she immediately turned away. "Tomorrow, Nathan," she said quietly. "Let's do it tomorrow." He let go of her hand, feeling his insides tighten. Linda went into the study, closing the door behind her. Nathan stood in the middle of the kitchen, listening to the clock on the wall tick. He was home, but home wasn't home. Something was wrong, and he was going to find out what. That night, Nathan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Linda slept next to him, but there was a gap between them. She wasn't pressed against him like she used to, her head on his chest. Her breathing was even, but he knew she wasn't sleeping. He could feel it. "Lynn," he whispered into the darkness, "what's wrong with you?" She didn't answer, but he heard her hold her breath, as if she was afraid he would hear her fear. Nathan closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he saw the sands of Syria, the faces of his team, the explosions that still echoed in his ears. And now, at home, he felt the same way he had felt there on the edge, waiting for something to break the silence. He didn't know what it would be, but he was ready to face it. Nathan Miller lay in bed, staring at the ceiling where the shadows from the streetlight danced like ghosts from another world, each one a fragment of the life he had left behind in the sands of Syria, where the dust was thick as smoke from explosions, and every breath was a reminder that survival was not always the same as being whole. He had only been home a few days, but those days had stretched into an eternity, filled with a silence that was louder than any artillery barrage, because in that silence he could hear the echoes of his comrades, the ones who had not returned, the ones whose faces now haunted him in every corner of this house that had once been a refuge, and now felt like a cage full of memories that stung sharper than bullets. The pain wasn't physical, no, his body, hardened by years of training and combat, held strong, but inside, in that part of his soul that can't be seen on X-rays, there was a gaping wound, leaking guilt and adrenaline that was still boiling in his veins, as if the war hadn't ended, but had simply moved to his head, where every day was a battlefield, and he was the only survivor, but the price of that survival was too high to bear alone. He rolled over on his side, trying to find a comfortable position, but sleep eluded him like a mirage in the desert, and instead he was replaced by images of himself lying in wait, sand crunching beneath his boots, the air thick with the smell of sweat and metal, the muffled voices of his team in his ears, Sergeant Ramirez always cracking jokes to break the tension, and Lieutenant Ford always calm as a rock. But on that last day, everything had gone wrong. An explosion had torn through the silence and Ramirez had disappeared in a cloud of dust, his scream echoing in Nathan's head and Ford. Ford had looked at him in those last seconds, that expression that said, "It's not your fault." But Nathan knew that was a lie, because he'd been there, he could have done something, he could have called out sooner, he could have turned the other way, and that guilt was eating away at him from the inside like acid, eating away at all the good that was left in him after 10 months of hell. The adrenaline was rolling in waves, making his heart pound like it did in the moments before the attack, and Nathan clenched his fists, trying to suppress it, but it was stronger, it was a part of him now, this eternal reminder that war doesn't let its soldiers go easily, it leaves scars, invisible but deep, and every time he closed his eyes, they bled anew. Linda was sleeping next to him. Her breathing was even, but Nathan felt the distance, the same one that had appeared at the airport and had not disappeared. It hung between them like an invisible wall, and he wondered if she saw these ghosts in his eyes, or if her coldness was caused by something else, something that she was hiding. But now, in this silence of the night, he could not think about it, because the memories were coming back with renewed vigor, and he saw the faces of the dead, heard their laughter, which was cut off by gunshots, and guilt covered him like a wave, whispering, "You survived, but they did not. Why you and not them?" And this question did not give him peace, forcing him to toss and turn, sweating, despite the coolness in the room. He tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the present, on Cody, asleep in the next room, on Linda, who was still here despite everything, but the ghosts were persistent, clinging to him like sand in the folds of his clothes that he couldn't shake out, and Nathan knew it was PTSD. He'd read about it, heard about it from other veterans, but knowing and feeling were two different things, and right now he felt broken, like glass that they were trying to glue back together, but the cracks were still visible. Suddenly sleep did overtake him, but it was not a rest, but an immersion in a nightmare where reality mixed with memories, and he was there again in Syria under the scorching sun, with a weapon in his hands, and the team was nearby, but the air trembled with a premonition of trouble, and here it was an explosion, screams, blood on the sand, and Nathan ran, shot, tried to save them, but his hands slipped, and the faces of his comrades melted, turning into masks of pain, accusing him. "Why didn't you save us?" And adrenaline lashed through his veins, forcing his body to react as in battle. He woke up abruptly, with a scream stuck in his throat, his body covered in sweat, his heart pounding like a drum, and in the semi-darkness of the room, he instinctively reached for the nightstand where his pistol lay, a habit developed over months in a war zone, where a weapon is always at hand, because death can come at any moment. His fingers closed around the handle, he snatched it up, aimed at the shadow by the door, ready to shoot, because at that moment he was not at home, he was out there in the war, where every rustle was a threat, and only a shot could save. Nathan! Linda's voice cut through the darkness, full of horror, and she jumped up, turning on the lamp, her eyes wide, her face pale as chalk, and Cody stood in the doorway, drawn by the noise, his small body shaking, his eyes full of fear, because he saw his father with a gun in his hands, pointing at nothing, and this was not the hero's comeback he dreamed of, but something scary from the movies he was not allowed to watch. Nathan blinked, reality returning slowly, like a fog clearing, and he saw them Linda huddled against the headboard, Cody frozen, unsure of what to do, and the gun in his hand suddenly felt heavy as sin, and he lowered it, placing it back on the nightstand, his hands shaking, his chest burning with shame and pain. "Dad," Cody whispered, his voice shaking as he took a step forward, but Linda stopped him with a gesture, her eyes darting between Nathan and her son, full of worry that she was trying to hide, but was showing like cracks in a mask. "It's okay, baby." Nathan tried to keep his voice calm, but it was hoarse, like he'd been running, and he stood up, walking over to his son, hugging him, feeling how tense his little body was. "Just a bad dream, nothing to worry about. Go back to bed, okay?" Cody nodded, but there was a question in his eyes that he didn't voice, and he walked away with one last look at his father, and Nathan was left standing, feeling the floor shift from under his feet, because he had scared them, his closest ones, and it was worse than any bullet, because the war had now invaded their home, and he didn't know how to stop it. Linda sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clutching the sheet, and she looked at him for a long time, silently, and then said quietly but firmly, "Nathan, this can't go on. You're, you're not here, not fully. I see you're suffering, and it scares me, it scares Cody. You need help." He turned to her, feeling anger mixed with despair, because he didn't want to be weak, didn't want to admit that he was broken. But her words were true, and he knew it. "I'm fine, Lynn," he lied, but even he himself didn't believe it, and sat down next to her, lowering his head. "It's just adaptation. It will pass." "No, it won't." She took his hand, and this time there was warmth in her touch, but there was desperation mixed in. "I've seen it before with others. You're not the first one to come back like this. Remember Dr. Paul Draven? He works with veterans, with Marines like you. He can help." Nathan remembered Draven, a quiet middle-aged man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much. He had met him at the base a couple of years ago when he had been giving mental health seminars, and Nathan had dismissed it as something for weaklings, but now he wasn't so sure. "I don't need a psychologist," he muttered, but there was no confidence in his voice, and Linda squeezed his hand tighter. "You do, Nathan. For us, for Cody, and for yourself. Please think about it." He nodded, unable to argue because the ghosts were still whispering in his head, and he knew that if they weren't stopped, they would destroy everything he had left. The next day, Nathan sat in the kitchen, staring at his coffee, which had gone cold, untouched, and his thoughts swirled in his head like a whirlwind, full of fragments of the past, where each fragment was a memory of lost comrades, of moments when death was breathing down his neck, and adrenaline made him act without thinking. But now, in a peaceful life, that adrenaline turned into poison, poisoning every moment. He heard Linda upstairs tucking Cody into school, her voice soft, soothing, and Nathan envied this normality that he had lost, because to him every sound was a potential threat, every rustle a signal to fight, and he found himself checking doors, windows, as if the enemy could appear at any moment. The guilt for the dead wouldn't go away. It sat in his chest like a stone, reminding him of Ramirez, who dreamed of a family of Ford, who left behind a wife and 2 children, and Nathan asked himself, why did I survive? What was it about me that allowed me to come back when they were left there, in the sand, and this guilt mixed with pain, making every breath heavy, as if the air was thick with dust. Cody came down, backpack over his shoulder, and approached his father, his eyes wary, as if he was afraid of scaring away something fragile. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked quietly, and Nathan forced a smile, ruffling his son's hair. "Of course, champion. Just thinking about things. Go, don't be late for school." Cody nodded, but before leaving he hugged him tightly, and there was a childlike sincerity in that hug that moved Nathan to tears, but he held back, because men don't cry, especially Marines, but inside he was crumbling like a house under bombs. Linda walked her son out and returned, sitting opposite Nathan, her face determined. "I called Dr. Draven," she said, not giving him time to protest. "He has time tomorrow. Will you come?" Nathan looked at her, seeing a mixture of love and fear in her eyes, and nodded. "I'll go. For you." But deep down he knew it was for himself, because the ghosts of war would not go away on their own. They needed to be exorcised, and perhaps Draven knew how to do that. The session with Dr. Paul Draven took place in a small office on the base, the walls covered with certificates and photographs of veterans smiling through thick and thin, and Draven sat across from him, notepad in hand, his gaze penetrating but not judgmental. "Tell me what's bothering you, Nathan," he said quietly, and Nathan began, reluctantly at first, but then the words flowed about memories, about wine, about the adrenaline that wouldn't let him rest, and Draven listened, nodding, not interrupting. "This is classic PTSD," he said finally. "You're not alone. We'll start with therapy, step by step." Nathan left there feeling like there might be light at the end of the tunnel, but the ghosts were still there, waiting to happen. The morning of the day when Nathan Miller first crossed the threshold of Dr. Paul Draven's office was one of those that seemed too ordinary for such a turning point in the life of a man who was accustomed to the roar of explosions and the whistle of bullets, and now stood before the door of a modest office building on the outskirts of Los Angeles, where the air was saturated with the scent of freshly mown grass and the distant rumble of the highway, reminding him how peaceful life can be deceptively calm, hiding beneath its surface the storms that play out in the souls of those who did not return from war in one piece. He stood there in a plain shirt and jeans that felt too soft after his uniform, clenching his fists in his pockets to hide the slight tremor that was trembling, because the idea of sharing his demons with strangers scared him more than any ambush in the Syrian sands, where at least the enemy was clear, in front of him, with a weapon in his hand, and here the enemy was inside, invisible and sneaky, and Nathan felt more vulnerable than ever, wondering if he should go in at all, or if he should turn around and leave, pretending everything was okay, even though he knew it was a lie that was already beginning to eat away at his family from the inside. Linda had insisted on it, her eyes that morning full of that mixture of concern and determination that always made him obey, and she had even offered to give him a ride, but Nathan had refused, saying that he could handle it himself, although deep down he was afraid that if she saw him in this state of weakness, the distance between them, which was already growing with each passing day, would become an insurmountable abyss, and he would lose her completely, and without her, this whole journey home would lose its meaning. Inside, the building greeted him with the cool of air conditioning and dim lighting, and the office he was sent to was furnished with a studied simplicity that was supposed to be comforting soft chairs in a circle, a table with coffee and cookies, pastel-colored walls decorated with abstract paintings that reminded him of the new painting in their living room, and the coincidence made his chest ache. But Nathan pushed the thought away, focusing on the people already seated in the circle. Veterans like himself, their faces scarred by scars both visible and invisible, some with prosthetics, others with empty stares, all of them seeming to him like mirrors of his own pain, which made the situation even more uncomfortable, because seeing your vulnerability in someone else's eyes was like a punch to the gut. And then there he was, Dr. Paul Draven, a man in his mid-40s, with graying temples that made him look like a wise mentor rather than just a doctor. He walked with the confidence of a man who knew the world revolved around him, but didn't brag about it, just used it to help others. Charisma flowed off him in waves. There was a genuine warmth in his smile that made people open up, and intelligence shone through in every word, in the way he looked around the room, gauging everyone's mood, and Nathan immediately felt a mixture of respect and wariness for him, because people like Paul could look deeper into the soul than anyone would like. "Good morning, gentlemen," Paul said, his voice deep and velvety, with a slight accent Nathan couldn't place right away, maybe Midwestern, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the way he sat in the circle, not on a platform but on equal terms, creating the illusion of equality, even though they all knew he was playing the game. "Good to see new faces. Nathan, right? Welcome." No judgment here, just support. Let's start with a circle. Everyone is welcome to share if they want, or just listen. Who's going to start? The session began with a story from one of the veterans, an older man named Jack who had served in Vietnam and still woke up with the sound of helicopters in his head, his words flowing slowly, with pauses full of pain, and Nathan listened, nodding. But inside him a storm was raging. He felt out of place among these people whose wars were different, whose traumas seemed more earned to him. Because his operation was secret, he couldn't even talk about it properly, and that made his story fragmented, incomplete, as if he had no right to this pain, and vulnerability grew with every word the others said, because he saw himself in them, but was afraid to open his mouth, lest he reveal the weakness that Marines are taught to hide deep inside. Paul led the session masterfully, asking questions that were sharp without being cutting, provoking without being pushy, his intelligence showing in the way he connected stories, finding common threads, and his charisma making him the center to which everyone was drawn, even those who were silent, like Nathan, who sat clutching the arms of his chair, sweat trickling down his back, a voice inside him whispering, "You don't belong here, you're stronger than this, get up and leave." But he stayed because he knew Linda was right, and these ghosts had to be exorcised or they would destroy everything. When it was his turn, Paul turned to Nathan with a smile that seemed genuine, but Nathan saw something professional in it, honed by years of practice, and it tugged at his ego. "Nathan, you're new. Want to share?" No pressure, but sometimes the first step is the most important. Nathan hesitated, his throat tightening as it had been in the moments before a parachute jump, but he nodded, determined, and began to speak, quietly at first, haltingly, of Syria, of lost comrades, of the guilt that gnawed at him from within, of nightmares where sand mixed with blood, and as he spoke the others nodded, their eyes full of understanding, but Nathan felt naked, raw beyond measure, because the words were tearing chunks of his soul out of him, and he hated that feeling of weakness, but at the same time he felt a little lighter, as if the burden had become a little lighter, and Paul listened attentively, nodding, his eyes keen, intelligent, taking each sentence apart, and when Nathan had finished, the doctor said, "Thanks, Nathan. What you're describing is classic survivor guilt, guilt that you're here and they're not. But remember, it's not your fault they're dead, it's only your fault you're not living for them. It's tough, but we'll take it step by step." Paul's words echoed in Nathan's mind, and the session continued with more stories, laughter over shared jokes about army food, tears over losses, and by the end Nathan felt part of the circle, not fully, but enough to know that it could help, and as everyone was leaving, Paul came up to him, shaking his hand firmly, confidently, with that charisma that made you believe in the best. "Good job today, Nathan. See you next week, and if you need a private session, call." Nathan nodded, muttering a thank you, and walked outside into the sun, blinding his eyes, and he took a deep breath, feeling the tension ease a little, but inside it was still seething, and he thought about Linda, who was waiting for him at home, or no, she said she would come over after work, but something in her voice was off, and it bothered him, but he pushed the thought away, deciding to focus on himself. But Linda was there, outside the office, having arrived earlier to pick him up, and when Nathan came out, he saw her standing by the car with Paul next to her, talking, and there was something intimate in their poses, too close, and Nathan froze, watching from a distance as Paul smiled that same charismatic smile. But now it seemed aimed at Linda personally, and she responded, her hand touching his arm in a gesture that could have been casual, but Nathan saw more in it. A light touch that lingered a second too long, and their eyes met. There was a spark in them that he recognized because he had once seen it in Linda's eyes when she looked at him, and it hit him like a bullet in the chest, hinting that the distance between them was not simply from his PTSD, but from something more, a secret that had been brewing in his absence. "Linda," he called, coming closer, and they pulled away from each other, but there was tension in the air, and Paul nodded at him, saying, "Nathan, glad Linda stopped by. We were just talking about your group. Good luck." And he left, but Nathan saw Linda watching him go, and there was something in her eyes that she quickly hid. But he noticed, and in the car on the way home the silence was heavy, full of unspoken questions, and Nathan felt the suspicions growing, mixing with the vulnerability from the session, making him even more broken, because if this was true, if there was something between Linda and Paul, then the war he was fighting inside would be another battle, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. But for now he was silent, looking out the window at the streets rushing by, thinking about how everything could collapse in an instant, and that made his return home not a triumph, but the beginning of a new war, where the stakes were higher than ever. Nathan Miller sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that he drank more out of habit than desire, because the taste had long ceased to please him, as if the war had burned away not only his soul, but also his ability to feel simple pleasures, like morning coffee or the warmth of the sun shining through the curtains that Linda had replaced in his absence, and which were now a bright blue, not cozy beige, and alien like so much of this house he was trying to call home again. It had been 2 weeks since he'd been back, and each one had been like walking through a minefield trying to be a husband, a father, the man he'd been before Syria, but every step was hard because the ghosts of war still whispered in his head, and the distance between him and Linda was growing like a crack in the pavement after an earthquake, subtle at first, but deepening with each passing day, and Nathan felt like he was losing her, though he couldn't quite put his finger on when it had started or why. He looked across the table at Cody, who was sitting across from him, munching on peanut butter toast, and tried to cling to these moments, this attempt at normalcy, because his son was his anchor, his reason to keep going, even when everything inside him was screaming that he couldn't cope. "Dad, are you coming to my game on Saturday?" Cody asked, looking up from his toast, his eyes shining with hope, and Nathan smiled, though it was a tired smile, like his facial muscles had forgotten how to do it. "Of course, champ," he replied, reaching out to ruffle his son's hair. "I won't miss it. Have you decided what trick you're going to show on the field yet?" Cody brightened up, talking about a new move he'd been practicing with his coach, how he was going to score a goal like his favorite player, and Nathan listened, nodding, trying to be there in the moment, but his gaze slid to the empty chair where Linda should have been. She'd left early that morning, saying she had a meeting at a volunteer organization where she helped with a charity project for veterans. But Nathan had noticed that these meetings had become too frequent 2, 3 times a week, in the evenings when she'd come home late, a little flush on her cheeks and a perfume he didn't recognize, sweet and jasmine not the vanilla and sandalwood kind he'd given her for their anniversary. This new scent clung to his thoughts like a splinter, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Linda was slipping away from him, and it wasn't just his PTSD, it wasn't just his paranoia, but something real, tangible, like those new earrings he'd noticed her wearing a couple of days ago, thin, silver, with little blue stones, not her style, and he knew for a fact he hadn't bought them. "Dad, are you listening?" Cody's voice brought him back to reality, and Nathan blinked, forcing himself to focus. "Yes, yes, sorry," he smiled wider, trying to hide his confusion. "Tell me, what happened with your trick?" Cody continued, but Nathan felt his thoughts drifting again, to Linda, to her distance, to the way she avoided his gaze when he asked where she had been, her answers too smooth, too rehearsed. "Volunteering, Nathan, you know how important it is," or "yoga club, I need to stay in shape." He wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to the Linda he knew who had been his rock, but the details were piling up like evidence in a case he didn't want to investigate but couldn't ignore. The phone she always held face down now, the frequent calls she answered in a whisper as she went into another room, the new clothes that appeared in her closet, too elegant for volunteering or yoga. Nathan was no detective, but he was a Marine, trained to notice the little things, to analyze them, and those little things added up to a picture that scared him more than any fight, because there the enemy was clear, and here he didn't know who he was fighting. That evening was quiet, too quiet, and Nathan sat in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, not paying attention to what was happening on the screen because his mind was elsewhere. Linda had left again, saying she had a volunteer meeting and had left in a new dress he hadn't seen before, a dark green, form-fitting, low-cut dress that looked more appropriate for a restaurant dinner than a fundraiser. Cody was upstairs doing his homework, and Nathan was left alone with the silence that was like a slab of concrete, and he got up and walked around the house, trying to find something that would bring back a sense of normalcy. But instead his eyes clung to details that screamed change. A new vase on the shelf, too delicate, with a subtle pattern, a new rug in the hallway, soft but somehow alien, and he stopped at the dresser in the bedroom where her things were, and froze because he saw a box of perfume, the same jasmine scent he'd noticed on her, and on the label there was a name he didn't recognize, and a price that made his eyebrows rise, because they'd never spent that much on things like that. He picked up the box, feeling something hot boil in his chest, a mixture of anger and fear, and at that moment his gaze fell on her bag, which she had left on the chair, a rare oversight, because Linda always put her things away. Nathan knew he shouldn't, knew it was a violation, but his hand went to the bag of its own accord, and he opened it, feeling his heart pounding like it was about to go to war. Inside was the usual: wallet, keys, lipstick, but then he noticed a small piece of paper folded in half and unfolded it, revealing a restaurant receipt, dated last week, for two, with wine and dessert, and more than they usually spent even on an anniversary. He stood there, looking at it, and a question swirled in his head. With whom? Volunteering, yoga, or something else? The door slammed and Nathan jumped, quickly putting the check back, closing the bag and walking back into the living room, trying to look calm as Linda walked in, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes shining, and she smiled at him, but the smile was forced, like she knew he suspected something. "You're early," he said, trying to make his voice sound neutral, but inside he was seething. "Yes, the meeting ended faster," she replied, taking off her coat, and the smell of that very perfume hit her nose like an accusation. "Is Cody asleep?" Doing her homework, Nathan looked at her, trying to catch at least a hint of the truth. "How did the volunteering go?" "Okay," she shrugged, walking into the kitchen. "I'm just tired. Do you want some tea?" He nodded, though tea was the last thing on his mind, and followed her, watching as she put the kettle on, her movements precise, but with a nervousness he was noticing more and more often. She pulled out her phone to check her messages, and Nathan watched as her fingers froze as the screen lit up, and she quickly put it away, but not before he saw a name Paul in the notification. "Who called?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice wavered. "Oh, just a fellow volunteer." Linda didn't look at him, focusing on the kettle, which hadn't boiled yet. "Nothing important." Nathan was silent, feeling the suspicions thicken like smoke before an explosion, and he wanted to ask, wanted to spill everything: the receipt, the perfume, the earrings, her detachment, but something stopped him. Maybe the fear of hearing the truth, or the hope that he was wrong, that it was just his PTSD playing tricks on him, making him see enemies where there weren't any. The next few days were like dancing on the edge of a cliff. Nathan tried to be the father Cody deserved, going to his baseball games, cheering loudly when he scored a home run, even having a family night with pizza and a movie. But Linda was there in body but not in spirit. Her smiles were few and far between, her responses short, and she went off to yoga again on Friday nights, coming home late with the same jasmine scent and the slight blush he'd come to hate. He began to notice more: the way she changed in the bedroom, closing the door when she'd never done before, the way her phone was always on silent, the way she avoided long conversations by immersing herself in work or volunteer work, and every time he tried to talk, she found an excuse to leave. One day, when Cody was at a friend's house and Linda was away at another meeting, Nathan couldn't take it anymore. He sat in the living room, looking at her coat hanging by the door, and made up his mind. He picked up her phone, which she'd left on the charger, another rare mistake, and entered the password he knew because it was their wedding date. The screen lit up, and he opened the messages, feeling his heart pounding as if about to have an attack. There were a lot of ordinary messages with coworkers, with girlfriends, but one name stood out: Paul Draven. The messages were short, but their tone was too warm, too personal. "Thanks for tonight, you were amazing. I can't wait to see you again." And the last one, from today: "Today at 7, like usual." Nathan felt like the floor was slipping out from under his feet, and he closed the phone, because he couldn't bear to read any more. When Linda returned, he was sitting in the dark, the light from the television flickering, but the sound off. She stopped in the doorway, her eyes widening as she saw his face. "Nathan, is something wrong?" Her voice was worried, but there was a hint of guilt in it that he couldn't help but hear now. "Where have you been, Lynn?" he asked, his voice quiet, but with a steel to it that he had never used with her. "I told you, Yoga." She turned away, taking off her coat, but her hands were shaking. "Yoga," he repeated, standing up. "With Paul Draven?" She froze, her face turned pale, and for a second Nathan thought she was about to tell him everything, but instead she straightened up, her gaze turning cold. "Have you been checking my phone?" Her voice was sharp, accusing, and it hit him because he was expecting an excuse, not an attack. "And you're giving me a reason, Linda." He stepped closer, feeling anger mixed with pain. "Perfume, earrings, restaurants, messages. What's going on?" She was silent, her lips trembling, and in that moment Nathan realized that the normality he had been clinging to was an illusion, and now he stood on the edge, not knowing whether to jump into the abyss or try to hold on. "We need to talk," she said finally, but her voice was so quiet he could barely hear her, and there was a mixture of fear and determination in her eyes that frightened him more than anything he had seen in the war. The silence in the Miller's house was deceptive, like the calm before a storm, when the air grows heavy and every sound seems like a harbinger of something irreversible, and Nathan Miller, sitting in the living room with the television off, felt that silence pressing down on him like a concrete wall ready to collapse, because the last few days had turned his life into a labyrinth of suspicions, where every turn led to new questions, and the answers slipped through his fingers like sand. Linda had left again, this time to meet a friend, she said, but her words sounded like a practiced lie, and Nathan could no longer pretend to believe it, because the perfume, the earrings, the restaurant receipt, and the texts from Paul Draven formed a mosaic that cut him from the inside like shards of glass, and he knew he had to find the truth, even if it tore apart everything he had left. Cody was at school, the house was empty, and Nathan decided this was his chance, a chance to understand what was going on, why Linda, his Linda, the woman who had been his anchor in his darkest days, now seemed alien, like she had been replaced by a doppelganger who wore her face, but not her heart. He walked up to the bedroom, his steps heavy, as if he were on a mission where one wrong step could be his last, and stopped at the dresser where Linda kept her things, the little things she always called her little chaos. Jewelry boxes, old photographs, notebooks. Nathan had never gone through her things. It was against his rules, but the rules had changed now, because the war had taught him that sometimes you had to break boundaries to survive, and now he was fighting for his family, for his life, which was collapsing like a house of cards. He opened the top drawer, feeling like a thief in his own home, and began to rummage through the contents. Scarves, makeup, a couple of old letters from her mother, nothing out of the ordinary, but then his fingers came across something hard, tucked into the far corner, a small wooden box, worn, carved with a flower pattern he had never seen before. Nathan pulled out the box, his heart pounding so loudly he half expected Linda to come in and catch him, but the house was empty, and he opened the lid, feeling the air grow thick with anticipation. Inside were letters and cards, neatly tied with thin ribbon, and at first glance they seemed innocuous thank-you notes from the volunteer organization where Linda supposedly spent so much time, notes from coworkers, cards with floral designs, and standard phrases like, "Thank you for your help," or "You make the world a better place." But the deeper he dug, the more notes he found were handwritten, and the handwriting was familiar neat, with a slight slant, like the one on the business card Paul Draven had given him after their first session. Nathan felt the blood rush to his head and began to read, his fingers shaking as he unfolded one note after another, each one a punch to the gut. "Linda, your energy is an inspiration to us all." Read one, signed Paul. Another, "Thank you for yesterday. You always know how to lift my spirits." They were short, but there was something too warm, too personal about them, and Nathan felt anger mingle with pain because these words weren't just thanks, They were the threads that connected Linda to a man he now realized was more central to her life than he could have imagined. He shuffled through the notes until he came across a letter folded in half on thick cream-colored paper, and his heart sank as he unfolded it and began to read. Dear Linda, I don't know how to express how important you are to me. These months have been hard. You know how much pain I see every day, but you are my light in this darkness. You help me cope, even when you don't know it. Your smile, your strength, they give me hope. I shouldn't write this, but I can't keep silent. Thank you for being there. Floor. Nathan read the letter 3 times, each word slamming into his mind like a bullet, and he felt everything inside him crumble, as if he were back in Syria, under fire, but now the enemy was invisible, and he didn't know how to fight it. This letter wasn't just a thank you, it was a confession, a hint of feelings that went beyond friendship or professional relationships, and the phrase, "You're helping me cope," sounded like an accusation in his head, because he, Nathan, was supposed to be the one helping Linda, sharing her burdens, but instead he was out in the desert, fighting ghosts, and someone else had taken his place. He clenched the letter in his fist, the paper crumpled, but he stopped himself, forcing himself to put it back, because if Linda knew he'd found this, things would only get worse. He closed the box, put it back, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the empty space where the shadows from the curtains danced on the wall like ghosts of his past, and his thoughts swirled in his head like a whirlwind, full of questions. How long had this been going on? Was it just an emotional affair or something more? And why hadn't Linda told him, tried to explain? He remembered her distance, her evasive answers, the smell of the perfume he hadn't given her, and it all made sense now. But that meaning was like a knife stabbing into his heart. Nathan tried to remember when it had all changed, tried to find the moment when Linda had started to pull away, but all he could see was her smile at the airport, cold as a winter wind, and her eyes that avoided him as if she were afraid he would see the truth. Linda returned home a couple of hours later, her steps light, almost inaudible, and she walked into the living room where Nathan sat pretending to watch the news, though the screen was merely a backdrop to his thoughts. She smiled, but her smile was strained, as if she could sense the tension in the air. "How are you?" she asked, taking off her coat and hanging it on a hook, and Nathan noticed her hand lingering on his collar, as if checking to see if it smelled of that perfume. "Fine," he replied, his voice even but seething inside, and he looked at her, trying to see the Linda he loved, but instead saw a woman hiding secrets. "And you? Like a friend?" "Oh, it's fine," she said, walking into the kitchen, her voice too cheerful, too artificial. "Just chatting, having coffee. Nothing special." Nathan nodded, but his gaze fell to her wrist, where a new bracelet glittered, thin and silver, with little charms he knew he hadn't bought. He wanted to ask, wanted to spill everything, the letters, the check, the messages, but the words caught in his throat, afraid of the answer, afraid the truth would ruin everything he'd tried to save. Instead, he said, "Cody will be back soon. Maybe we should order pizza?" "Good idea," Linda smiled, but her eyes avoided him, and she went into the kitchen to put the kettle on, as if this ritual could bring back normality. That night Nathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling where the shadows seemed to reflect his fears, and Paul's letter swirled in his head, each word an accusation. "You help me cope." He thought of Linda next to Paul, maybe smiling at him, sharing with him what had once been Nathan's alone, and the thought was worse than any nightmare, because nightmares end, and this was reality. He turned to Linda, who was asleep, or pretending to be asleep, her breathing even, but he knew she could feel his gaze, and in the silence between them lay a chasm full of unspoken words and secrets he now knew but could not say. In the morning, he decided he couldn't wait any longer. He would go to Paul Draven, not as a patient, but as a husband, and demand answers, because if the war had taught him anything, it was that you had to face your enemy, even if that enemy was the truth that could destroy everything. The sand crunched under his boots like bones, and the air was thick with heat and smoke, saturated with the smell of gunpowder and blood that mixed into a pungent symphony of war, where every breath reminded Nathan Miller that he was still alive, although deep down he wasn't sure he was anymore, because Syria, Operation Blue Storm, had burned away the humanity in him, leaving only a shadow of the Marine who once knew how to laugh, how to love, how to believe in tomorrow. It was that day that he replayed in his head every night like a broken film, with images of explosions and screams and his comrades' faces changing so fast that he didn't have time to breathe. And now, sitting in his house in Los Angeles, where the silence was colder than the desert wind, Nathan felt that flashback rolling in again, dragging him back to the hell from which he had physically returned, but which had never left his soul. Flashback, Syria, 10 months ago. The night was moonless, the sky above the desert a black blanket, strewn with stars that gave no light, only emphasized the darkness, and Nathan lay in cover, pressed close to the ground, his machine gun cold in his hands despite the heat, his heart beating steadily like a machine because years of training had taught him to keep it in check, even when adrenaline pounded his veins like a hammer. Operation Blue Storm was a secret mission, the mission to destroy an arms depot that was feeding the local gangs, but things had gone wrong, as they often do in places like this, where plans crumble under the weight of chaos. Their squad, 8 men, had made their way to the target under the cover of night, but their intelligence had failed, and instead of an empty depot, they had stumbled upon an ambush, shadows in the sand, gunfire, and screams that tore through the silence like knives. "Ramirez left," Nathan called, his voice hoarse but firm, and he saw Sergeant Ramirez, his best friend, grin despite the danger, his teeth flashing in the dark as he answered. "Calm down, Captain, I see them. Give me a couple of seconds, and these bastards will regret being born." Ramirez had always been like that, easygoing even under fire, his jokes a lifeline in this hell, and Nathan clung to them because they reminded him that they were still people, not just killing machines. But that night, the jokes didn't help. A grenade blast tore through the air, the ground shook, and Nathan felt sand rush into his face, blinding him, and Ramirez's scream, sharp and full of pain, hit his ears like a gunshot. "Ramirez!" Nathan rushed towards him, ignoring the bullets that whistled nearby, and saw his friend lying a few meters away, his leg torn apart by shrapnel, blood gushing out, mixing with the sand, and his face pale, but he still tried to smile. "Damn, Captain, I think I've ruined my new boots," he croaked, but his voice was shaking, and Nathan could see life draining from his eyes, slowly but surely. "Hold on, brother, I'll get you out." Nathan knelt down next to him, trying to apply a tourniquet, but his fingers were slipping from the blood, and the shots were getting closer, and the voice of Lieutenant Ford, second in command, cut through the noise. "Miller, we have to leave. There are too many of them. We're pinned down." Nathan looked at Ford, then at Ramirez, who squeezed his hand, his fingers cold despite the heat. "Get the boys and go, Nathan," Ramirez whispered, his voice weak but steely. "I'll cover you. Don't let them die in vain." Nathan knew it was an order, but not one he could follow. He couldn't leave his friend, couldn't leave him under fire, but Ford grabbed his shoulder, his eyes full of fury and fear. "Captain, if we stay, we'll all die. Think about the mission, about the guys." In that moment, Nathan made the hardest choice of his life, the choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He nodded to Ford, squeezed Ramirez's hand one last time, whispering, "I'm sorry, brother," and ran, leading the rest of the squad away, leaving Ramirez in the sand, under the bullets that soon died down, but whose echoes sounded in his head every night. They had accomplished the mission. The warehouse had been destroyed, but the price had been too high. Ramirez, his laughter, his jokes, his dreams of family, all left there in the desert, and Nathan carried that guilt like a cross that grew heavier with each passing day. The present. Nathan woke from his memories, sitting on the living room couch, his palms clammy, his heart pounding as if he were back there, under fire, and he realized he had clenched his fists so hard his nails had dug into his skin, leaving red marks. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the cold calm was the complete opposite of the chaos he had lived through, but somehow the silence scared him more, because in it he heard not only the echoes of the war, but also the emptiness that had settled between him and Linda. He had come home to find comfort, to hold his wife, his son, to feel human, but instead he had found someone else's perfume, someone else's earrings, letters from Paul Draven, and each of these items was like another bullet piercing his armor, reminding him that he had lost not only Ramirez, but perhaps his family as well. Linda was at another meeting, Cody was asleep upstairs, and Nathan sat in the dark, feeling the memories of Syria and the suspicions about Linda tangled together in a knot that was choking him. He thought of Ramirez, of his last look, full of trust, that Nathan had betrayed by leaving him to die, and that guilt was the root of his withdrawal, his failure to be the husband and father Linda and Cody were waiting for. He wanted to be with them. He wanted his life back to what it had been like before the blue storm, but every time he looked at Linda, he saw her withdrawal, her secrets, and it was like a mirror reflecting back his own brokenness. He couldn't blame her entirely. He'd been gone for 10 months, leaving her alone with Cody, with their house, with their life, and maybe she'd found solace in someone else, in Paul, who was there, who didn't wake up screaming, who didn't hold a gun by his bed, who didn't look at the world like it was a battlefield. Nathan stood up and paced the living room, his eyes falling on the photograph on the mantelpiece of him and Linda and Cody on the beach 3 years ago, their smiles so real, so alive, and he felt tears sting his eyes, but he blinked them away because Marines don't cry, even when everything is falling apart. He thought about Paul's letter, about the words, "You help me cope," and wondered if he had ever helped Linda cope, or if he had only hurt her, like the time he had woken up with a gun in his hand, terrifying her and Cody. The contrast between the heat of war and the cold of home was unbearable out there. He knew who the enemy was, he knew how to fight, and here he was as helpless as a child lost in the desert. He sat back down, covering his face with his hands, and at that moment he heard the key turn in the lock. Linda came in, her steps light, but Nathan felt her presence like an electric shock. She stopped in the doorway, her silhouette dark against the light from the hallway, and she said, "Are you awake?" "No," he said, his voice hoarse, and he looked at her, trying to see the Linda he loved. But instead, he saw a woman who was hiding secrets. "Where have you been?" "With a friend." Her answer was too quick, and she walked past, avoiding his gaze. "I'm tired, Nathan. I'm going to bed." He wanted to stop her. He wanted to ask about Paul, about the letters, but instead he kept quiet because he knew the truth might be the final blow, and he wasn't ready to take it. But deep down he knew that this moment would come, and when it did, he would have to make another choice, one as hard as the one he had made in Syria, and he was afraid that he would lose someone he loved again. Nathan Miller sat in his pickup, parked in the shade of an old oak tree on a quiet street in suburban Los Angeles, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, as if he could strangle his doubts if he only squeezed hard enough. But the doubts were stubborn, like the sand from the Syrian deserts that still crunched in his memories, reminding him of the war, of the losses, of the decisions that had torn his soul apart. And now this new war, the war for his family, forced him to act, even if every step was like walking on a razor's edge, where one wrong move could destroy everything. The letters he had found in Linda's box, especially the one from Paul Draven with his words, "You help me cope," burned inside him like a hot coal, and he could no longer sit back and pretend that everything was okay when Linda left in the evenings with evasive explanations, her perfume smelling of someone else's life, her eyes avoiding his as if she were afraid he would see the truth. Nathan was a Marine, a man trained to find the enemy, to analyze, to act, and now he was using those skills not on the battlefield, but in his own home, and that made him both the hunter and the hunted, because the truth he sought might be the final blow. The decision to install the GPS app on Linda's phone came to him one night, after another nightmare in which he saw Ramirez bleeding in the sand and Linda walking into the darkness, and he woke up feeling like he was losing everything he had left. He knew it was a violation, that it was a step beyond trust, but trust had already cracked like glass, and he saw no other way than to find out where she was going, who she was spending her time with, while he tried to pick up the pieces of himself after Syria. Installing the app was a matter of minutes. He waited until Linda had showered. Her phone was on the kitchen table, and Nathan, feeling like a traitor, entered the password, the same one that was their wedding date, and installed a hidden app that tracked her location. His fingers shook, but he forced himself to follow through, because ignorance was worse than the truth, whatever it was. The first few days of surveillance yielded nothing. Linda went to the office, to Cody's school, to the supermarket, but then he noticed a pattern. Twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, her phone would pick up at the same address, in the area where Paul Draven, the psychologist who ran his veterans group, and whose name kept popping up in texts and emails, had his office. Nathan checked the address online. It was a small office complex where Draven rented an office. And every time Linda said she was going to volunteer or yoga, her route would take her there, and she would stay there for 2, sometimes 3 hours, returning home with a slight blush and the smell of that jasmine perfume he now hated. Nathan looked at the map on his phone, where a blinking dot marked her location, and felt anger boiling in his chest, mixed with pain, because every visit to this address was like further proof that Linda was slipping away, and he didn't know how to keep her. He tried talking to her, trying to recapture the closeness they had had before he left for Syria, but every conversation ended with her evasive answers or his own silence, afraid to voice his suspicions, afraid that she would confirm them. One night, when Cody was staying over at a friend's house and Linda was gone again, Nathan decided he had enough. He couldn't sit in that cold house any longer, where every object, a new couch, a new painting, a new perfume, was a reminder of how everything had changed. He took the keys to his truck and drove to Draven's office, knowing that no one would be there on Saturday because Paul had mentioned in one of their sessions that he only worked weekdays. This was his chance to learn more, to find something that would either confirm his fears or allay them, even though deep down he no longer believed the latter. The office complex was quiet, almost deserted on a weekend afternoon, and Nathan parked off to the side so his truck wouldn't attract attention. He pulled on a dark jacket, pulled his cap low on his head, and walked to the back door, where he knew from experience that the locks were often simpler than the front doors. His skills, honed over years of service, came in handy. He had the lock open in a couple of minutes, using the pick he kept in his glove compartment, not because he was planning break-ins, but because he was used to being prepared for anything. It was dark inside, smelling of paper and coffee, and Nathan moved as silently as a shadow, his heart pounding but his hands as steady as they were when he was sneaking through enemy territory. Draven's office was on the second floor, his nameplate gleaming in the dim light, and Nathan stepped inside, closing the door carefully behind him. The room was as he remembered it from his sessions: a circle of chairs, a table with a coffee pot, walls lined with certificates and photographs of veterans. But now he looked at everything with different eyes, the eyes of a man looking for evidence, not help. He started at the desk, checking the drawers, but there were only folders with notes on patients, pens, notepads, nothing personal. Then he turned to the shelves where there were books on psychology, a few figurines and photographs. And there, among the pictures from conferences and group sessions, he saw a photograph of Linda. It was framed, small, but it stood out because Linda was smiling in it in a way she hadn't smiled at him for a long time. Her eyes were shining, her hair was loose, and she was wearing the same dark green dress he had seen her wear that night when she returned from volunteering. In the background was the restaurant, the same one whose receipt he'd found in her bag, and Nathan felt the ground shift beneath his feet because this wasn't just a photograph. This was proof that Linda and Paul had spent time together, and not in an office, not in sessions, but somewhere where they were close, too close. He picked up the photograph, his fingers shaking, and noticed the writing on the back, in black pen. Linda, thank you for brightening my day. Paul. The words were an echo of the letter he'd found in the box, and they hit him like a bullet, because there was no way to deny that there was something between Linda and Paul now, something she'd kept from him while he'd been trying to pick himself up after the war. Nathan put the photograph back, careful to position it exactly as it had been, because he didn't want Paul to know he'd been here, not yet, not until he'd decided what to do next. He walked out of the office as quietly as he had walked in and climbed into the truck, his breathing heavy as if he had been running for miles under fire. He looked at his hands, still stained with Ramirez's blood, and thought that he had made a choice then to save the others, but now he didn't know what choice to make to save his family. Linda had been his home, his beacon, but now that beacon was fading, and he didn't know how to light it again. He started the engine and drove home, but in his head he had a plan. He would face Paul, not as a patient, but as a husband, and demand the truth, because the war had taught him that you had to face your enemy, even if that enemy was a man who knew your weaknesses better than you knew yourself. When he got home, Linda was in the kitchen, making dinner, and she smiled at him, but her smile was strained, as if she sensed he knew more than he was letting on. Nathan looked at her hair, still smelling of that perfume, and said, "We need to talk, Lynn, tomorrow." She nodded, her eyes full of worry, and Nathan knew that this would be the last night he could pretend everything was okay. Tomorrow he would learn the truth, and it might destroy everything he had tried to save. The evening in the Miller house was filled with silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that was comforting. It was the kind that foretells a storm, when the air grows heavy as before a thunderstorm, and every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the ticking of a clock, the distant hum of a car outside the window seems to signal the beginning of something irreversible, and Nathan Miller, sitting in the living room with the television off, felt that silence pressing down on him like a slab of concrete, because his mind was filled with images he couldn't shake. The photograph of Linda in Paul Draven's office, her smile, the one that had once belonged only to him, the inscription on the back, "Thank you for the light in my days," and the letters hidden in the box where Paul's words, so warm and personal, were like knives piercing his heart, reminding him that he was losing everything he had fought for, not in the war, but here in his own house. He waited for Linda, knowing that she had gone off to volunteer again, but the GPS app on her phone showed that she was in Draven's office, and this fact, like the last straw, broke the camel's back, forcing him to decide on a conversation that he had been putting off for too long because he was afraid of the truth. But now ignorance was worse than any answer, even the most painful. Cody was at a friend's house for the night, and the house felt even emptier, as if the walls had absorbed their estrangement, and Nathan sat clutching an empty mug, his fingers shaking, not with fear, but with anger mixed with despair, because he, a Marine accustomed to facing the enemy, now didn't know how to fight what was destroying his family from within. He heard the key turn in the lock, and Linda walked in, her steps light but wary, as if she sensed that this evening would be different. She paused at the door of the living room, her coat still around her shoulders, the scent of that same jasmine perfume he now associated with betrayal hitting his nose like an accusation. "You're late," Nathan said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but there was the steel in it that he used in battle, and he stood, his shadow falling on the floor like a barrier between them. Linda froze, her eyes meeting his, and there was a flicker of alarm in them that she hadn't managed to hide. She took off her coat and hung it on a hook, and her movements were too deliberate, as if she were trying to buy time. "Yeah, the meeting ran late," she replied, her voice soft but taut, like a string about to snap. "Is Cody at Mike's?" "Yeah." Nathan stepped closer, his gaze as hard as a scope, and he saw her shoulders tense. "But we're not talking about Cody. We're talking about you and Paul Draven." Linda flinched, her hand hovering over the bag she was holding, and for a second Nathan thought she was going to leave, running away from this conversation. But she stayed, her eyes wide, and there was a mixture of fear and guilt in them that he couldn't help but notice. "What do you mean?" Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but there was no surprise in it, and that was worse than if she had pretended. "I know, Linda." Nathan took another step, his voice growing louder, shaking with anger he could no longer contain. "I know about your volunteering, about your trips to see him. I followed you, yes, I put a GPS on your phone because you lied to me every time you left. I found the letters, Linda. His letters. You're my light. You help me cope. And the picture in his office. You are with him. You with Paul. You cheated on me." The question hung in the air like a shot, and Linda stepped back, her back against the wall, clutching her bag as if it would protect her from his words. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she did not look away, and that was worse than a lie, because in her silence was the truth he was afraid to hear. "I didn't cheat on you, Nathan," she said finally, her voice shaking but firm, as if she'd summoned all her courage to say it. "Nothing physical, never." Nathan felt his anger stumble over those words, But the pain didn't go away because her confession, even like that, was like a punch to the gut. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers, and he saw her lips tremble, but she didn't back away. Then what happened, Linda? His voice was hoarse, full of pain that had been building for weeks. You go to see him twice a week. You wear perfume that I didn't give you, earrings, bracelets. He writes you letters as if you were his. His what? A lover? A friend? What are you to him? Linda closed her eyes, her breathing heavy, and when she looked at him again, her eyes were full of tears, but there was a determination in them that he hadn't expected. I don't know how to explain it, Nathan, she said quietly, her voice shaking, but she continued. Paul was there for me when you weren't. You were gone for 10 months, and I didn't know if you'd come back. I waited, I held on for Cody, for us, but it was so hard, and you didn't call, you didn't text, and I felt alone, like I'd lost you before you even came back. Paul, he listened. He helped me cope. And yes, I did develop feelings for him, I'm not going to lie. But I didn't cross the line. I couldn't because I still loved you. Her words were like an explosion that tore everything apart inside Nathan, and he felt anger and pain and guilt, the same one that had haunted him since Syria, since the day he left Ramirez to die mixed into one lump that was choking him. He wanted to scream, he wanted to blame her, but her truth was as sharp as his own, and he knew she was right. He had left her even when he returned, because his soul was still there, in the desert, with the blood and the sand. You say you love me, he said, his voice low, almost broken, but you look to him for comfort. You shared with him what should have been mine. I try, Linda. I go to Draven. I try to be a father to Cody, a husband to you, but I'm broken, and I thought you were my salvation, and you found someone else. Linda shook her head, her tears flowing freely now, and she stepped towards him, her hand touching his chest, but he didn't pull away, even though everything inside him screamed at him to leave. You left us, Nathan, even when you came back, she said, her voice full of pain, but there was a strength in it that made him listen. You're here, but your eyes are empty. You flinch at every sound, you scream at night, you keep a gun by your bed, and I can see how much you suffer, but you won't let me near you. I tried, I waited, but I'm not made of iron. Paul gave me what you couldn't. He listened, he was there. But I didn't want him, I wanted you, Nathan, but you were so far away. Her words were like a mirror showing him his own wounds, and he felt the guilt for Ramirez, for his detachment, for his inability to be who he had been before the war, wash over him with renewed force. He looked at her tear-stained face, and for the first time in weeks he saw not only his pain, but hers as well, the pain of a woman who had waited for him, but had not lived to see the Nathan she loved. What do we do, Lynn? He asked, his voice almost a whisper, full of weariness and hope. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose Cody, but I don't know how to fix this. Linda looked at him, her eyes full of tears, but there was a spark in them, the same one that had been between them in the best days, when they were not just husband and wife, but a team ready to go through anything. We need to start talking, Nathan, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Not blaming, not hiding, but talking about your war, about my mistakes, about how we can be a family again. It's going to be hard, but I'm ready if you are. He nodded, feeling something shift inside him, like cracked ice beginning to melt, and he reached out his hand and she squeezed his fingers, and there was more truth in that touch than in any of the words they had spoken. They stood in the quiet of the kitchen, holding hands, like two people who knew the battle was not over, but were willing to fight together, even if the enemy was their own fears and mistakes. It was a deceptively clear morning in Los Angeles, the sun casting a golden glow over the streets, but to Nathan Miller the light was cold, as if it couldn't warm the darkness that had settled in his soul since his conversation with Linda the previous day, where her words, "I had feelings for him, but I didn't cross the line," echoed in his head like explosions in the desert, reminding him of war, of loss, and how easily everything he thought was solid could crumble like a house of cards in a gust of wind. He sat in his pickup truck, parked in front of the office complex where Paul Draven held his sessions for veterans, and his fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that the leather creaked and a fire raged in his chest, a mixture of anger, pain, and despair, because he knew that this conversation with Paul would not be just a showdown, but a battle where his family, his life, was at stake, and he was not sure if he could come out of it victorious without losing himself. Linda was still at home, her tear-stained eyes and trembling hands still standing in front of him, but he could not wait any longer. He could not allow Paul Draven to remain a shadow that was destroying his marriage, and he decided to face him head-on, like a Marine accustomed to looking the enemy in the eye, even if that enemy did not have a machine gun, but charisma and words that had stolen his wife's heart. Nathan walked into the building, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of Syria on his shoulders, and in Paul's office, which smelled of coffee and paper, he found him sitting at his desk, a notepad in his hands, his graying temples and calm smile the same as in the sessions. But now Nathan saw in them not professionalism, but a threat, a man who had entered his life like a thief in the night. Paul looked up, his eyes widening for a moment in surprise, but he quickly regained control, his charisma like armor that Nathan wanted to pierce. "Nathan," Paul said, his voice soft but wary, like a man who knows he's walking in a minefield. "Didn't expect you today. It's not the day of the session. Is something wrong?" Nathan closed the door behind him. His movements were sharp, and he stepped toward the table, his fists clenched, ready to strike, but he forced himself to stop because he knew that one wrong move could cost him everything, not just Linda, but Cody, his son, who was the only anchor keeping him from falling into the abyss. "You know why I'm here," Nathan said, his voice low and hoarse, as if each word was a struggle. "I know about you and Linda, the letters, the photograph, her visits to you. I want you to leave her alone, my wife." Paul leaned back in his chair, his face calm but a shadow in his eyes, not fear, but something else, perhaps regret or even defiance. He folded his arms across his chest, his posture relaxed, but Nathan could see his fingers trembling slightly, betraying tension. "Nathan, let's talk calmly," Paul began, his voice level, like a man accustomed to diffusing conflicts. "I'm not going to deny that Linda was here, that we talked. She came to me because she was having a hard time. You were in Syria 10 months, and she was alone, with her son with you gone. She didn't come to me as a wife, Nathan. She came as a woman who felt alone." The words were like a punch to the solar plexus, and Nathan felt his anger flare up again. His fists clenched so hard that his nails dug into his palms, and he took a step forward, his face inches from Paul's, and he saw him tense up despite his charismatic mask. "Alone?" Nathan growled, his voice shaking with rage. "She's my wife, Paul. Mine. And you write her letters, call her your sunshine, put her picture on your shelf like she's yours. Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I can't see that you're trying to steal my family?" Paul raised his hands in a placating gesture, but his eyes were hard, and he didn't look away, which only angered Nathan even more. "I didn't steal her, Nathan," Paul said, his voice calm but steely. "She came to me because she needed to speak, to feel heard. You came back, but you weren't there for her. You know that. Your war is still in you, and she can feel it. I didn't force her to come. I didn't ask her to feel anything for me. It happened because she was vulnerable, and I'm not a saint, Nathan. I'm human." Nathan felt the blood rush to his head, and in that moment it was all he could do not to grab Paul by the collar of his shirt and slam him into the wall. His fist rose, shaking, and he saw Paul tense up, ready to strike, but there was no fear in his eyes, only understanding, which infuriated Nathan even more because it was like a mirror showing his own guilt. "You're human," Nathan nearly shouted, his voice echoing in the small office. "You took advantage of her loneliness, you intruded into my family, and now you're telling me you're just human. I've killed people for less, Paul. Give me one reason why I shouldn't smash your face in right now." Paul stood up slowly, his movements careful, but he didn't back down, and that was a mistake, because Nathan felt his control crumbling, like that day in Syria when he left Ramirez, and now he was ready to go off like a grenade without a pin. "Because you're not like that, Nathan," Paul said, his voice quiet but firm. "You're a Marine, you know what control is. And you know that if you snap, it won't bring Linda back. It won't save your family. It could cost you Cody. The mention of his son was like a cold shower, and Nathan froze, his fist still clenched, but lowering it, feeling anger war with terror, because Paul was right. If he snapped, if he hit him, it could go to court, it could go to the police, and Linda, already on edge, might decide he was too dangerous to be around Cody. The risk of losing custody was real, and that thought was worse than any fight, because Cody was his light, his reason to live, and losing him would be worse than losing herself. "Are you threatening me?" Nathan asked, his voice low and dangerous, but there was no longer the same rage in it, only fatigue and pain. "No, Nathan." Paul shook his head, his eyes full of sympathy that Nathan hated. "I'm trying to help. Not just you, but Linda and Cody. I don't want to break up your family. I'll step away if that's what you want. But you have to be with her, really, not just in body, but in spirit. She still loves you, Nathan. She told me so herself." The words were like a knife in his heart, because they confirmed what Linda had said yesterday, but there was hope in them too, a thin thread that Nathan wanted to cling to. He stepped back, his breathing heavy as after a fight, and he looked at Paul, at his calm face, and he realized that he hated him not for what he had done, but for being there where Nathan could not be. "Get away from her," Nathan said, his voice cold as an order. "If I see another letter, another photograph, I won't be so reserved. This isn't a threat, Paul. It's a promise." Paul nodded, his eyes serious, and he said nothing, but Nathan could see that he understood. He turned and walked out of the office, his steps heavy, as if he carried the pain of this conversation on his shoulders, and when he got into the truck, his hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the knowledge that he was standing on the edge, and one wrong move could cost him Cody, Linda, everything he had left. He drove home, and Paul's words were playing in his head, "She still loves you," and he knew he had to find a way to get himself back, not just for Linda, but for Cody, for himself, because the war had taught him that the only things worth fighting for were those that really mattered, and his family was the most important thing. The Miller house, usually filled with the sounds of life, Cody's footsteps on the stairs, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, Linda's voice humming as she worked, was now engulfed in a silence so thick and heavy that Nathan Miller felt it like a physical weight on his shoulders, as if he were back in Syria under a backpack full of gear, but there was no enemy to see, only the void left by Linda's departure that morning with a small bag, her eyes red from crying, her voice shaking as she said she needed time to think things through. Nathan stood in the doorway, watching her get into the car, her blonde hair flashing in the window, and in that moment he felt like he was being abandoned in the desert again, like he had when he had made the choice to leave Ramirez, only this time it wasn't a friend he was losing, it was his wife, and the loss was deeper because it wasn't permanent, but it still tore at his heart like shrapnel. Linda hadn't said where she was going, to a friend's house, to her parents, or maybe to Paul Draven, and Nathan hadn't asked, because he knew any answer would only make the pain worse, and he was already teetering on the edge, trying not to fall for Cody, who was still with him, his little anchor in this storm. Cody sat in the living room, his head glued to his video game, but his fingers moved slowly, without the excitement he usually had when he played, and Nathan could see his son sneaking glances at the door, as if hoping Linda would come back, and that hope, so pure and childish, was like a knife stabbing into Nathan's chest, because he didn't know how to explain to an 11-year-old why his mother had left, why their family, which had seemed so strong, was now falling apart. Nathan tried to be the father Cody deserved, but every day was an endurance workout, learning to be alone, learning to cope with the silence that now filled the house and the ghosts of war that still whispered in his head, reminding him of Ramirez, of the guilt, of how he had failed to save his friend, and now it seemed he couldn't save his family either. He looked at Cody, at his disheveled hair and concentrated face, and knew that for his son's sake he had to find strength within himself, even if everything inside was crumbling like walls under fire. "Hey, champ," Nathan said, sitting down on the couch next to Cody, trying to keep his voice light despite the lump in his throat. "Can we take a break? Play something together?" Cody looked at him, his eyes serious, too serious for a child, and he shrugged but didn't pull away like he sometimes did in recent days when he sensed tension between his parents. "Is Mom coming back?" he asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper, and Nathan felt his heart squeeze because he didn't know the answer, but he couldn't lie to his son. "She'll come back, Cody," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "She just needs a little time. Sometimes adults need to think. But you and I, we're a team, right? We can do this." Cody nodded, but his eyes were full of doubt, and Nathan realized that words weren't what his son needed. He needed action, something to show that Dad was there, that he wasn't going to leave like Mom. Nathan stood up, clapping his hands to break the silence. "Come on," he said, his voice firmer, like a captain giving an order. "Let's do something cool. How about some pizza? And then we can build that model airplane you wanted." Cody's eyes lit up, and he smiled for the first time that day, and it was like a ray of light in the darkness that reminded Nathan why he was still fighting. They ordered pizza pepperoni, Cody's favorite, and while they waited for it to arrive, Nathan pulled out the box containing the model airplane they'd bought before he'd left for Syria, and they sat at the kitchen table with the pieces and the glue and the paint. Cody chattered, talking about school, about the time his friend Mike had tried to do a trick on his skateboard and fallen, and Nathan listened, laughing, feeling the tension in his chest ease for the first time in a long time, as if this moment, this simple evening with his son, was a bridge back to the normalcy he'd been trying so desperately to regain. "Dad, have you flown one of these?" Cody asked, holding up the tiny F-16 model, his fingers sticky with glue, but looking at his father with such admiration that Nathan felt something in him come alive, like he was not just a broken veteran again, but a hero in his son's eyes. "Not really," Nathan said, smiling, his voice soft but proud. "I was mostly on the ground, with the guys with a machine gun. But I saw these little guys flying above us, covering us. They're like angels, only with missiles." Cody laughed, and the sound was like music, drowning out the whispers of the ghosts in Nathan's head, and he realized that this was the first real moment of closeness he'd had with his son since he'd been back. They worked on the model, arguing over how to glue the wings on just right, and when the pizza arrived, they ate it out of the box on the living room floor, and Cody talked about how he wanted to be a pilot like his dad, only a flying one, and Nathan listened, nodding, feeling his resolve growing to be the father Cody deserved, even if Linda didn't come back. But when Cody went to bed, the silence came back, and Nathan was alone in the living room, looking at the picture on the mantelpiece of him and Linda and Cody on the beach, their smiles so real and so far away, and he felt the pain coming back because Linda was gone, and he didn't know if she would come back, and that uncertainty was worse than any fight because in a fight he knew what to do, and here he was helpless. He was learning to be alone, learning to be a father without Linda, but every night when the house grew quiet, he felt the loneliness wash over him like sand in the desert, and he wondered if he could ever be the man he had been before the war, or if this crack in his soul would be forever. He lay in bed, but he couldn't sleep, and he stared at the ceiling where the shadows from the streetlight danced like ghosts, and he thought about Linda, about what she had said, about how she had said she still loved him, but had left because she didn't know how to live with his war. He thought about Paul Draven, about the promise he had made in his office, and how close he had come to losing it, and the risk of losing Cody if his anger got the better of him. But now, in this silence, he realized that he had to find a way not just for Cody, but for himself a way to live, not just to survive, because Linda might come back, and she might not, but Cody was here, and for him, Nathan had to be stronger. He got up early that morning, made Cody breakfast peanut butter toast, just the way Cody liked it, and when his son came downstairs, sleepy but smiling, Nathan felt a spark of hope light up inside him, thin but strong, like a thread that could keep him from falling. He hugged Cody tightly, as if he wanted to convey all his love to him, and said, "We'll get through this, champion. No matter what, we're a team." And Cody nodded, his eyes full of trust. And in that moment, Nathan knew that this closeness, this small moment with his son, was something he would fight for, even if Linda never came back, even if the war in his soul never ended. It had been a month since Linda had left home, leaving Nathan Miller alone, with the silence as his companion and the emptiness of the house as his soul's emptiness. But that month had been more than just a series of days. It had been a time when he had learned to live again, not just for Cody, his son who had become his anchor, but for himself, because he had realized that he could not be a father, a husband, a man, unless he found a way to make peace with the ghosts of war that still whispered in his head, reminding him of Ramirez, of the sand soaked in blood, of the choice that had broken him. Nathan waited for Linda, waited for her return, but not with the hope of reconciliation, but with the desire to understand what was left of their family, of their love. And when she called, her voice was quiet, trembling, but decisive, offering to meet to talk for real. Nathan agreed, feeling something squeeze in his chest, something like fear, but also relief, because he was tired of uncertainty, tired of the war he was waging within himself and with her. They agreed to meet on neutral ground, Paul Draven's office, the same therapeutic circle where Nathan had first felt vulnerable, where veterans had shared their scars, visible and invisible, and now that circle had become the arena for another kind of battle, not for life, but for truth. Nathan walked into the office, his steps firm but his heart pounding as if about to attack, and he saw them, Linda sitting straight, her face pale but her eyes determined, and Paul looking calm but with his hands folded in his lap, a little tense. Nathan sat across from them, a circle of empty chairs between them, but he could feel the air between them sparking, as if about to explode, and he knew that Islamicized. Nathan, Linda began, her voice soft but firm, and she looked him straight in the eye. I have to be honest. With you, with us, with everything. Nathan nodded, his face unreadable, but inside he could feel the anger and hurt fighting against the fatigue that had built up over the months. Paul sat silently, his gaze neutral, but Nathan saw his fingers clench, and it gave him an odd satisfaction Paul wasn't as calm as he wanted to appear. I love you both, Linda said, her words like a blow, but Nathan didn't look away because he already knew it, and yet each word was like a bullet. But it's a different kind of love. Paul, he gave me understanding, support when I was alone. You, Nathan, you're Cody's father, my past, my family, and I'll never stop loving you for that. But I don't know what to do with you when you're not here, not with us. The words echoed their previous conversation, but they sounded different now because Linda was being honest, painfully honest, and Nathan felt his heart tighten, but he didn't let his anger get the better of him. Paul spoke, his voice level and professional. Nathan, I didn't want to interfere with your family. Linda came to me as a friend, as someone who needed help. I didn't plan for things to go this far. If I caused pain, I'm sorry. Nathan looked at him, his fists clenching, but he remembered Cody, his smile, their evening with the model airplane, and it kept him from losing his temper. He took a deep breath, his gaze moving from Paul to Linda, and he said, his voice low but firm, I'm leaving, but not because of you, but to find myself. Linda gasped, her eyes widening, and Paul frowned, but Nathan continued, his words like a release. I can't be who you want me to be, Linda, until I get myself sorted out. I carry the war inside me, and it's destroying us. I've signed up for a veterans program. I'll work with young fighters, help them so they don't end up like me. Cody will stay with me until you're ready, but I have to leave to be a better person for him, for me. Linda began to cry, her tears were silent, but she nodded, and Nathan could see that she understood, even if it tore her apart. Paul was silent, his face unmoving, but there was a respect in his eyes that Nathan hadn't expected to see. You'll always be part of our family, Nathan, Linda said, her voice shaking. I hope you find yourself. Nathan stood up, his heart heavy but feeling a strange relief, as if he had finally made the right choice, not for himself, but for those he loved. A month passed. Nathan lived in a small apartment near the base, where the Veterans Outreach Program was taking place. He worked with the young fighters, sharing his experiences, his scars, and each day he felt his soul slowly healing, as if he were learning to breathe again. Cody spent weekends with him, and their bond grew stronger with each passing day. They talked, laughed, made plans, and Nathan saw the pride in his son's eyes that gave him strength. One morning, he received a letter from Linda. It was short, written in her neat handwriting, and every word was like a sting, but also like hope. Nathan, I'm with Paul. We're trying to build something new, but I often think about what you said about how you want to find yourself. I'm proud of you. Cody says you've changed, you laugh more. That makes me happy. I hope you find your way. Linda. Nathan folded the letter, his heart aching, but he smiled because he knew he had made the right choice, even if it was painful. That same day, he took Cody to the beach where they had once been a family. The sky was clear, the wind was blowing the waves, and he and Cody were flying a kite, bright red, like blood and hope. Cody laughed, tugging on the string, and the kite rose higher, dancing in the sky, and Nathan watched it, feeling the warmth spreading in his chest. They didn't speak. There was no need for words, because this moment, this laughter, this kite in the sky was their language, the language of love and hope, which, like the kite, rose higher despite the wind. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.